Good afternoon, everyone. I, Preeti Kashyap, welcome you all to the third CPD session of today, hosted by Eschan Publishing. It is with great pleasure that we gather here together for an insightful CPD session on the pivotal role of assessment in tailoring instructions. I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Priyamvada Agrawal, an eminent ELT expert and a catalyst of transformative teaching practices. Dr. Priyamvada Agarwal brings a wealth of expertise to our session. Her academic journey is marked by a doctorate in in Indian English drama and a specialization in English language teaching. Armed with postgraduate certifications from the English and Foreign Language University, Hyderabad, Dr. Agarwal has led over 500 teachers training workshops, contributed extensively to CBSE school curriculum development, and collaborated with prestigious institutes like Cambridge Assessment English. Her dynamic career encompasses a global footprint, having presented at international conferences and contributed significantly to the academic landscape of Indian universities. I encourage each one of you to actively participate in this interactive session. Share your insights and experiences and questions to enrich our collective understanding of leveraging assessments. So before I hand it over to Dr. Priyamvada ma'am, I'd like to mention some housekeeping rules to you all. Participants will be muted throughout the entire session. Please ensure you have a pen and a paper to note down important information. The chat box will only be enabled during Q&A round and as required by the speaker. To receive your e-certificate, please fill out feedback form that will be sent to your registered email IDs after the session. Remember to participate in the quiz after this session. We will share the quiz link with you as the session ends. Without further ado, let us extend our warm welcome to Dr. Priyamvada Agarwal as she unravels the transformative potential of assessment in shaping personalized instruction. Ma'am, over to you. Ma'am, you're on mute.
Thanks a lot, Preeti. It's always a pleasure to interact with teachers and share experiences as well as learn from their experiences also. I'll quickly share my screen. Once I share my screen, just give me a thumbs up if it's visible to all, and then we can start. Is my screen visible to you? Preeti, is my screen visible to you?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Thanks a lot. So today's topic is assessment, a powerful tool to tailor instruction. When I was asked to do this session, the word assessment, when it comes to your mind, when you hear the word assessment, you automatically think of tests. And each one of us has gone through so many tests ourselves. Being teachers, we know what kind of thoughts come to a student's mind when it is assessment as a word or when it is test as a word that we hear. But of late, there has been so much research into assessments. There is so much focus on assessment in NCF also. There is so much that is going on around assessment that now assessments are being talked about not only from the perspective of testing somebody, but from a very larger perspective, from a very deep perspective of helping students learn also. So assessment is something that can help students learn also. But how? That is exactly our topic for today, a powerful tool to tailor instructions. Just to tell you, the agenda for our session today is There is no rocket science behind understanding what does it mean by assessment being a tool to tailor instruction. So with very quick analogies, we will understand general life analogies, we will understand as to what does it mean by assessment being a tool to tailor instruction. Then we will quickly talk about the purpose of assessment, the challenges that are being faced in assessment. Everybody being in education would have come across these terms assessment, for, of, and as learning. So we will have a quick rundown of what these terms actually mean and how they differentiate from each other and how they contribute into the teaching learning process. We will look into the key principles of effective assessment, because once we look into them, that will give us a better understanding of dealing with assessments. And lastly, we will talk about the types and forms of assessment. So when we are talking about analogy of assessment, I'm sure everybody cooks at home. So uh, suppose guests are coming at home and we are under the pressure of making the best of the food. So what is that usual quick thing that we do when we are cooking? We simply taste our dishes while we are cooking. Do we not do that? We usually do that. So when we are tasting our dishes, it helps us to adjust the seasoning and flavors to get the dish right. In exactly in the similar manner, assessment help educators understand how well students are grasping with the material. Based on the assessment results, educators can tweak their teaching methods. They can add more explanations where needed. They can introduce new activities that students are learning effectively. So this is just like adjusting the seasoning when we are making our dishes to make them perfect. So that is an example with which all of us can relate to. Another simple example from the field of sports also. Now, just imagine there is a coach who is coaching a student or a sportsman onto the field of a football ground. So, when a coach is analyzing a player's performance, he observes the player is consistently missing shots on goals during practice. So, what is the coach likely to do? In that kind of a scenario, the coach will then focus on improving the player's shooting techniques, particularly. They could provide targeted drills for the sportsman, individual coaching sessions, or video analysis to help the player develop better accuracy and scoring ability. Similarly, in education also, there are so many kinds of assessments that we can use to understand students' strengths, their progress, the areas of improvement, and all of this allows educators to adjust their teaching to meet the specific needs of students. So these two simple analogies help us understand as to why do we need to look at assessment as a tool also to tailor our instructions. It's not just assessment has the purpose of just promoting a student or just using at the end of the year. Assessment has a larger reason also. Now, let us look at the purpose of assessment. What do you think is the purpose of assessment? Can you mention in the chat box what, according to you, is the purpose of assessment? If in the chat box you can let us know as to what do you think is the purpose of assessment. What, according to you, is the purpose of assessment? If you can quickly write in the chat box. Okay, so somebody is saying to check the conceptual clarity. to check the understanding level, to find the better result, abilities of students. All of you have rightly said this. Let's look at what is the purpose of assessment when it comes to NCF. So NCF has very clearly told us that it refers to any process of gathering information about student learning that can be interpreted, analyzed, and used by the teacher and others also for guiding the teaching learning process. This aggregated at relevant junctures and helps in reporting student progress over time. So, as all of you have rightly said, it helps you to understand the abilities. So, when we gather information, assessment helps us to analyze, interpret, uh, do the necessary reporting, and it leads or feeds into the teaching learning process on frequent intervals to understand as to what is to be adjusted, how it is to be given, what more is to be done. So that is the purpose of assessment, clearly laid down in our national curriculum framework also. Assessment of, for, and as learning. Okay, before I really talk about it, can you quickly read this and mention in the chat box as to which one is assessment of learning, which is for learning, and which is as learning? One of them is measurement of achievement. The other is to gather evidence of student learning. And the third one is basically for self-reflection and introspection, which becomes developmental and constructive in nature. So, okay, let's go one by one. The first one, what do you think? Is it assessment of learning, for, or as? Okay, somebody saying it is as. The first one, according to you, is as learning. Okay. Okay. What is the second one, according to you? Is it for, of, or as? Second one. Now give me answers in the chat box for the second one. So now the answers begin for the second one. Is it for learning, of learning, or as learning? Okay, so some of you said the first one is as, some of you said the second one is for, and some of you said of also. Okay, so let me quickly tell you about it. The first one is assessment of learning. Assessment of learning, what does it mean? The first one is not as, it is of. So of learning is basically when you assess a student to know how much a student has been able to learn. So basically you measure their achievement that they have been able to do. That is assessment of learning. Now, second is assessment for learning. What it means is you need to gather evidence of student learning, which will help you in teaching learning process. So once you get an evidence as to how much a student knows, then you use that evidence to further design your instruction. So assessment when designed meaningfully can be used as a powerful tool that contributes to and supports better student learning and teaching practices. So when you use evidence to design your instruction, that is known as assessment for learning. So you are making it, you are assessing somebody so that you can then contribute into the student's learning by tailoring your instruction. And the last one is assessment as learning. So what it means is recent studies have shown that students can play an active role in taking charge of their own learning. When assessments are introduced as non threatening tools for self reflection and introspection, they become developmental and constructive. So, that is assessment as learning. So, while we are assessing, but we are reflecting ourselves. So, with that reflection and introspection, we are constructing our own knowledge. That is assessment as learning. We all know the theory of constructivism. We all understand the meaning of it, that constructivism basically tells constructing or building new knowledge. So when assessment is happening, and through that assessment, if we are doing introspection, then we are developing new insights ourselves of our own learning. So that is assessment as learning. So these are the terms that are used across when we are talking about assessment. When you read any kind of literature, you will very often come across these three terms, and they are very uh, powerful, as well as they encompass the complete cycle of assessment, as well as the different perspectives on assessment. So it is very important to understand the finer differences between assessment of learning, for learning, and as learning. Okay, what do you think are the challenges in conducting assessments, or what are the challenges of assessment with your day-to-day life experiences of teaching in school? Can you mention the challenges of assessment that you have experienced? In the chat box, you can leave your answers, maybe in a one word or one sentence. What do you think are the challenges of assessment? Very good. There are different level of students, but one assessment for all. Yes. Poonam ma'am, you can write your answer in the chat box, please. Yes. Poonam ma'am, you can write your answer in the chat box. So any other challenge that you think is there when we are conducting assessments in the schools? Very good. Few methods of assessments are used, but that's not a challenge really. Okay. Very good, Nazia ma'am. Children are scared. That is also a challenge. It is difficult to compare. Yes. Okay. Finding out the bright and late bloomers. But is that an objective or the challenge? Excellent. There is somebody who's saying in the chat box that they are not on the conceptual clarity. Very good. They are just based on midterm and end term exams. Neeraj sir very rightly said they are based on theoretical, uh, should be based both on theoretical and practical approach. Very good. So all of you have given very correct answers and different kind of challenges. Time management is also one challenge. But if we look at the main challenge, if we try to hit the nail at the right place, these are the challenges which are impacting the quality education standards. Our assessments are mostly mechanical and routine based. And the biggest challenge is they measure rote learning of content rather than the achievement of competency and learning outcome. As a few of you mentioned, that students are scared of assessments, they have the fear. NCF also mentions that the biggest challenge in assessment is they are intimidating. Students usually get labeled because of their assessments. Students are segregated. Some of you mentioned in your chat box late bloomers or bright students. So this is exactly the kind of mindset that is there in the society or in the education circles. They are labeled, they are segregated based on the basis of marks which they have scored in test or examinations, and this then have social consequences also. So this is your challenge of assessment. Now when we come to the key principles of effective assessment, let us look at 6 key principles that will help us in uh, dealing with these challenges, that will help us understand the finer nuances of assessments also. So the first principle of assessment is assessment should measure achievement of competencies and learning outcomes leading to attainment of curricular goals. We will spend 2 minutes on this particular slide to understand what it really means. So I'm sure all of you would have flipped through National Curriculum Framework, at least if you have not read it completely. If you look at National Curriculum Framework that was released in 2023, Part C of National Curriculum Framework talks about all the subjects that are taught or all the disciplines that are taught in school. There are 8 curricular areas that are mentioned in National Curriculum Framework. Each discipline is divided broadly into 3 parts. It will tell you what are the curricular goals of that particular discipline. It will tell you what is the pedagogy that is to be adopted, and then it will tell you the assessment also that should be used in that particular curricular area. So every discipline would have certain curricular goals to be achieved at each of these stages in the schools, whether it is foundational, preparatory, middle, or secondary. Now, when those curricular goals are laid down, those curricular goals are broken into competencies, and those competencies are further broken into learning outcomes. So, here is just a simple example for us to understand. For example, in foundational stage, one of the domains is language and literacy development. In this domain, one of the curricular goal is that children should develop effective communication skills for day-to-day interactions in 2 languages. Now, this is a very broad curricular goal. This goal to be realized and this goal for the students to be able to achieve it has to be broken down into competencies and learning outcomes. So say one of the competencies to achieve this goal is children should be able to listen to and appreciate simple songs and rhymes and poems. Now, to be able to achieve this particular competency also, these are the learning outcomes on which the teachers and students will be working on daily basis. For example, they will be listening to a wide variety of songs and poems. They will be listening and enjoying humming a variety of songs in different languages regularly heard in the home and neighborhood. They will be listening to longer sentences, songs, and poems with attention and have conversations about them. So, this way, your learning outcomes, your competencies, and curricular goals, all of them are laid out. So, when we, just to give you an idea, the other competencies in the same curricular goal are mentioned right there on the screen. Not that you have to read all of them. This is just to give you an idea that how there are various competencies for each curricular goal. But the point that we are trying to achieve over here is that when we are designing assessments, if they need to be effective, then they should measure the achievement of these competencies and learning outcomes. Accordingly, they should be designed. The second principle of assessments is they should be constructive, developmental, and learning focused. So, assessments, if they need to really serve the purpose of what they are meant for, then A, it should be an ongoing process. There can be both formal and informal ways to gather evidence. And the evidence that we gather, it helps us to understand the effectiveness of pedagogy. But on what terms do we measure the effectiveness of pedagogy? What the students have understood. So when we are using any pedagogy, has it been good enough, relevant enough to make the students understand whatever we wanted them to understand? What needs to be worked on? So when we are designing the assessment, it helps us understand. In case of a student has not been able to achieve the particular learning outcome or the competency, then what is it that needs to be worked upon so that we can reach the goal that is mentioned? What methods of teaching should be adopted and what methods of teaching work or don't work? What kind of resources work or don't work? So all of this evidence helps us in planning our teaching. And all of this evidence can only be gathered when assessments are designed effectively. So the third most important principle of assessment is they should be stage appropriate. We all know that National Curriculum Framework has laid down 4 stages. One of them is foundational, the other preparatory, the third is middle, and the fourth is secondary. So, National Curriculum Framework is now very categorically talking about observation being the main form of assessment in foundational stage. A lot of the schools usually go for paper pencil tests in foundational stage also, but in some of the domains, paper pencil test cannot work. Physical development as a domain, socio and emotional domain, ethical domain, aesthetic domain. In those domains, paper pencil test cannot work with foundational stage students. So observation is the key assessment activity that is laid down for stage appropriacy in National Curriculum Framework. In preparatory and middle stages, there are multiple tools that can be adopted, multiple methods that can be adopted. We will be looking at different kind of tools or methods later in our presentation. And when we are talking about secondary stage assessments, when we are talking about they being stage appropriate, we have to ensure that students are prepared for standardized tests, or largely the board exams or any other kind of examinations that are there. So the third effective principle of assessment is they should be stage appropriate. The next effective principle is it should accommodate diversity. Some of you had mentioned in the chat box that usually there is one kind of assessment only for every kind of child. But it's very clear that yes, one size cannot fit all approach. So there should be variety of assessments if we really want them to give us the kind of data that we require. If we really want that assessment should assess a child's achievement, assess a child's performance, then there should be different kind of methods that we need to adopt. The next principle of effective principle of assessment is they should be supported by timely, credible, and constructive feedback. Feedback is such a powerful thing if we really want our students to move ahead. With feedback, what comes into mind also is uh, during COVID times, we all have seen that how online teaching was happening. We have all seen that how a lot of the teachers went to record videos and post them on YouTube. And a lot of the students would also be of the mindset that yes, every information is available on online. Just on the click of the mouse, uh, there will be a lot of information on websites. There will be so much information available through videos. But is that sufficient? No, because internet or videos can just give you information, but it cannot give you the feedback when a student is going wrong. And it is only a feedback that can help a student understand where they have gone wrong or what is it that they need to do to be able to improve upon their things. So, feedback should not be just excellent, good, those kind of praising remarks. Feedback should be constructive in nature. When we say constructive in nature, it should give information as to what has worked well, what needs improvement, and how this can be done. I'll just give you very good example for you to understand this. When we give any kind of a remark in anybody's copy or on assessments, excellent work, very well done, they are all very flimsy kind of remarks which does not help a student to understand how well they have done. Against it, if we give them qualitative feedback, then it helps them understand what is correct, what needs to be improved. If you see on the screen, I have given you two very good examples of kind of feedback that can be given to students. When we say, the suppose this feedback is given on the essay a student has written. The introduction paragraph has a clear thesis statement well developed. The arguments are also logical, but the rebuttal is missing. This is given in on an argumentative type of an essay, a persuasive essay. So a student knows as to what has gone right. A student knows what is something that has to be incorporated or what needs improvement. There is another example. For example, if a student, your answer is correct, but would be more effective if an evidence is given from the text. So I've even given you a question and an answer. Suppose the question was describe Cinderella's mother. We all know the story of Cinderella. That is the reason I have uh, given this question. And in response to this question, if students had to give this had given this answer, she was rude, selfish, and partial towards her daughters. There is nothing wrong in this answer. But then, uh, if you were to give a feedback which can further enhance students' learning, then let them know, okay, your answer is correct. But if you give evidence from the chapter, from the story, where did you find her rude? Or because a story will never say that Cinderella's mother was rude, selfish, or partial. It will develop just like a story would develop. You basically infer that character is partial or is selfish or is rude. So ask students to give evidence to their answer. Then you can help them understand, okay, this kind of a feedback will help them understand that what is it that they need to do to be um, more powerful in their learning. So if we have to give feedback, it should also be very, very timely, because only if it is timely, then it makes relevance to a student. If the feedbacks are delayed, students lose their interest. And the last principle of assessment is they should support in meaningful aggregation and summation of student learning. We all know summative assessments exist and they are necessary also. But of late, what has started to happen is summative assessments are basically just testing a student's memory, whereas that should not be the case. If we really want our assessments to be powerful, then we need to change the approach. How do we need to change the approach? They should rather focus on conceptual understanding of a child. Some of you did mention this in the chat box that one of the challenges of assessment is they do not check the conceptual clarity, application of concepts, problem solving ability, critical thinking. These are the kind of things that our assessments should check rather than checking whether a student remembers something or not. I'll give you a very good example also of it here. I've again taken an example from the story of Cinderella because that is something for which you do not need a contextual understanding. You already have that. If a question is based as what was Cinderella's fairy godmother's name, then the answer to this question relies more on the memory of a child. A student is not really showing his or her understanding, his or her uh, critical thinking, application of concept or problem solving ability. Whereas if against this, a question is given to a student, if you were Cinderella, how would you solve the problem of not having a suitable dress for the royal ball? What materials would you use and how would you make the dress? That is something that will help you understand how much a student can solve a problem, how much a student has been able to understand the situation of Cinderella, what resources she had, how much a student have been able to understand the story, the theme of the story, and then respond to it. So when we are talking about effective assessments, they should support a meaningful aggregation or summation of students' learning. So, quickly a recap of all the principles of effective assessment. They should measure achievement of competencies and learning outcomes. They should be constructive, developmental, and learning focused. They should be stage appropriate. They should accommodate diversity. They should be supported by timely and constructive feedback, and they should support in meaningful aggregation of student learning. Moving ahead to types of assessment. We all know that there are two types of assessment, formative and summative assessments. But it is very important to know the purpose, timing, consequences of each one of them. If you can just focus on the highlighted words, the words in red color, that will help you understand what we mean by this. There are a few questions in the chat box. I will come back to them in the Q&A session. As of now, when we are talking about types of assessment, formative assessments are very, very powerful. They are continuous and ongoing because these are the assessments which can help us to track how much a student has learned and what feedback is to be given. See, formative are required because we cannot wait till the end of the year for the student to complete the assessment, because at the end of the year, the purpose of assessment would be rather to promote a student. So formative assessments are purposeful for the simple reason they improve teaching and learning. Whereas summative assessments give you the end result to determine how much a student has been able to achieve the curricular goal, competency, or learning outcome. The timing of it is formative are used throughout the process, whereas summative is used at the end of a lesson. When we are talking about throughout the teaching learning process, you can use beautiful exit ticket prompts. There are so many that are available on internet. You can design your own exit ticket prompts to quickly check as to how much a student knows or has been able to understand and grasp while you were teaching. And you can quickly adjust as to your teaching also. Now, when you usually ask these kind of questions, have you understood? Students would nod their answers yes or no, whereas that yes or no doesn't give you any kind of information. But when you want qualitative information, has whether a student has really understood or not, you need to ask them questions. And that is something that help you in your teaching learning process. Consequences of these kind of assessments are also very important. Formative assessments are very low stake assessments. Why do we say low stake assessments? Because not much is at risk when we are doing formative assessments. Rather, they help us in understanding as to how do we quickly adjust our teaching, what method is working, not working. Whereas summative assessments are high stake assessments, because these are those assessments on which rests the potential of promoting a student. Feedback. For formative assessments, immediate feedback is provided and they guide in instruction, in tailoring the instruction. Whereas summative assessment, feedback is often given after completion. Sometimes, if teachers are really very keen, they can draw a lot of insights from summative assessments to adjust their teaching for the next year, but it may not really help the student immediately. So immediate feedback in formative assessments is of paramount importance and gives a lot of information both to a teacher and to a learner. There are various examples of formative and summative assessments. And integration, when we are talking with learning, formative assessment, it is done throughout the process. And summative assessments can be used for both formative purposes as well as for summative purposes. So now quickly coming to the last part of our session today, the forms of assessment. Now, when we are talking about forms of assessment, can you mention in the chat box as to what are the different forms of assessment that you know of? They can be useful at any stage of teaching, foundational, preparatory, middle. They can be useful at any stage of teaching. What are the different forms of assessment that you know of? Quickly, we are running short of time, so maybe just 2 minutes where you can mention a few of the forms. Portfolios, class test, yes. So summative and all those things are types of assessment, but we are talking about forms of assessment. Okay. Oral assessments, yes, very good. So when we are talking about forms of assessments, largely written tests are there in which we have objective type questions, constructed response questions, and graphic organizers. When we are talking about objective type questions, we all know there can be MCQs that we use with our students. There can be fill in the blanks, matching, sorting types, sorting based on any criteria, picking the odd one out, or maybe labeling a diagram, solving a crossword, unscrambling a word. There can be solving riddles, there can be word grids, short one word answers. So there can be various objective type questions that can help us. Constructed response questions. When we are talking about constructed response questions, these are those questions that require students to frame and write answers. They can be both close-ended or open-ended. But what is really important when we want to give constructed response questions to students is students should have a very clear and detailed idea of the scoring guide. Why is this important? See, usually when we are also working as adults, normally, if we know the objective, if we know the criteria, then we follow that criteria diligently. So if students also know the criteria, if they also know the scoring rubrics, for example, when we score a letter writing, we give them marks for format, we give them marks for salutation, subscription, we give them marks for body of the letter. So we should let them know what will be the scoring rubric. If they know that, then they will pay attention to it. Okay, whether I have written my salutation, subscription, date, all those things. The third written test type, graphic organizers. One of my favorites, most powerful forms of assessment, graphic organizers. So, it requires good enough understanding of a text when we have to convert that text into graphic organizer. So we need to understand a text, understand what concept is linked to the sub concept, how it is linked, to be able to pull out the key information from a text and then plot it into a graphic organizer. So graphic organizers is one of very powerful forms of assessment which can be used across stages. You can use graphic organizer even at the foundational stage also. You can simply use them at the preparatory stage by asking the students to just list the things. So there can be so many types of graphic organizers that you can use to powerfully assess a student. The next kind of assessments that we are talking about, some of you mentioned in the chat box also, oral tests. See, reading aloud, listening and responding, recitation, debates and discussions, and presentations. There can be many other forms, but largely these are the forms that we are talking about. Now, when we are talking about reading aloud, word recognition, fluency, voice modulation, all these skills can be assessed when students are reading aloud. You can also ask students to summarize things once they have read something. That is also something that can help you to quickly assess a child. When we are talking about listening and responding, students listen to a text and respond orally also or on a worksheet. This can be usually used in languages and sometimes it can be used in other subjects also. Recitation is something that can be used especially at the foundational and preparatory stage. Students spoken language with specific focus on pronunciation, intonation, comprehension. These expressions and actions, these can be assessed through uh, recitation. When we are talking about debates and discussions, they are particularly useful in middle and secondary stages. Uh, uh, we usually do a lot of debates and discussions, but particularly I would want to mention over here that debates and discussions can be helpful in science and social sciences also. In science and social sciences, we can integrate environmental dimension of curriculum in subject specific tasks. So much can be done in debates and discussions. Students can make presentations also. The third kind of an extempore talks, yes, is another kind of oral test. The third kind of assessment that we would want to discuss is practical tests. In practical tests, students are expected to demonstrate their skills and applications of their new learning. Experiments, they are a very good way of finding out whether the students can do something. Can they do science? Not just answer questions about science. As I had mentioned in the challenge section also, one of the challenges of assessment is rote memorization. We really don't want them to tell us just the definition of science concepts. or social studies concept. We want them to be able to do things. And that is only possible when we make them do experiments, demonstrations, artifacts, and projects. When we are talking about demonstrations, particularly in curricular areas like art education, physical education and well-being, vocational education, when we are talking about these curricular areas, assessment is usually based on the demonstration of the skills and abilities. For example, if we want to test a child in physical education, we would want them to do dribbling on the field. We would want them to do dribbling in basketball and then tell us, rather than telling us what is dribbling. Can a student do dribbling or not? So, when we are talking about artifacts, especially in art and craft products, in vocational education, they help us in assessing a child. Projects are excellent way of assessing a child, but a word of caution: if students have actually done a project the way it is to be done, a lot of scaffolding is required for students to do projects. Projects are basically structured activities. When students do projects, they need to investigate. They have to explore things. They need to respond to complex questions. There are real world challenges in doing a project. There are actual problems. And you know the beauty of projects? Through projects, you can basically assess a student's soft skills also. There is so much focus on the 4 C's of 21st century skills. We talk about collaboration, we talk about communication, critical thinking, creativity. All these things can be easily assessed through projects. Portfolios. Portfolios are excellent because basically they tell you about the student's efforts, the complete journey of a student's efforts. So these are the different forms of assessment that we can use in our classroom. And there can be many more apart from these. But the whole idea is, as mentioned before, they should be designed meaningfully, addressing the diversity of the students, using different types, being stage appropriate. There shouldn't be a monotony, with timely feedback given to the students. Only then can they work and help us in achieving the real purpose of using assessment data to feed the teaching and learning process. If it is just meant for promoting a student, then no, they are not really serving the larger purpose of assessment. So, Preeti, can we take the questions now, please?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for an enlightening and thought-provoking session on this transformative role of assessment in instructional adaptation. Your expertise and insights have undoubtedly enriched our understanding of effective teaching and practices. So participants, we are open to your questions. Please post all your questions in the chat box so that ma'am can answer you all. Participants, please post your questions in the chat box.
Somebody had mentioned that instructions should be crisp and clear. That is very rightly said. When we are designing our assessments, a lot of the time students know the answers, but instructions, if they are not clear and crisp, students tend to make mistakes. Preeti, in case if there are no questions, we can still request the participants to post their questions on Facebook or YouTube, because I'm sure this session is there on YouTube and Facebook. Or sorry, it's there on YouTube, right?
Yes, ma'am. It's going
Yes.
live over there.
So participants can post their questions on the YouTube live also, in case there would be any questions once the session is over. We can give responses over there also.
Right.
Ma'am, there's one question. It was asked during the session for pre-primary teachers, writing skills. Please tell us, are there any writing skills for pre-primary teachers?
Okay, so when we are Tanisha, if I've understood the question correctly, when we are talking about pre-primary students, we largely are talking just about the mechanical writing. We are not talking about writing for meaning. Students are still learning to write letters. They are still struggling with their fine motor skills. They are still developing the knack to write only. So usually there are two aspects to writing. Writing, the mechanical writing part, the handwriting part, to be able to form letters, and the second part is about to be able to express yourself through writing. So at foundational stage, as we all know, students are still learning to write letters only. So if we are talking about assessments, so yes, if you are teaching them to write, then if you want to know are they able to write or not, that they can only show us by doing it on a paper. So that is the reason it was mentioned, one has to design assessment keeping in mind the content, keeping in mind the learning outcome. So if the learning outcome is whether a child can make uppercase letters, then the assessment will have to be accordingly. You will have to ask the child to be able to write uppercase and then show you, if you really want to assess them in the form of assessment. So this is like a thumb rule which goes across stages. Whatever is your content, whatever is your objective, design your assessment accordingly. So it should not be for rote memorization, but keeping in mind your learning outcome and competency.
Ma'am, there's another question. Is assessment only way to analyze the progress of students?
Largely yes, because any form of assessment, whether it is observation also, that also for assessment is a very broad word. It's an umbrella term. So even if you are using portfolios, it's a form of assessment only. It's an informal way. It's a long process. If you're using observation, that is also a form of assessment. So yes, assessment is the only way to analyze. Otherwise, there is no. So assessment is basically the term that is used for all of these things.
Right. Ma'am, there's another one. For grade 3 students, can we do assessment by A activities?
I didn't understand what is A activity. What is A activity?
Ms.
Maybe we can
Madhusmita,
take
could you please elaborate on your question?
We can take the last question. What should be the basics of writing cursive, capital or print? We make them write in cursive and read and print. Don't you think it's confusing most of kids while going through reading? That's
By
an
an
excellent
activity,
question.
okay.
Yes, that's an excellent question. Okay, I'll quickly answer both the questions. So, ma'am, Miss or Mr. Shafaq, that's a very, very valid point that you have brought to the discussion over here. And you know, globally also there is a discussion, a perennial discussion that goes in the education circles whether cursive should be taught or print should be taught. So there is not a fight between cursive or capital. It is fight between cursive and print, for the simple reason we watch print everywhere, but we make them write cursive. Now, there are pros and cons of both the things, and there are different schools of thought. But yes, cursive requires very fine motor skills. So, in the beginning, it should be print script only. So, we all understand how difficult it is for the students to make those curves, loops, and everything. So, if we start with print script, then it becomes easy for them to write. And that is the reason we even start with the capital letters first, and then comes the lowercase letters. So when we are talking about print script, once the student will start to write, then automatically they will start to write in the cursive in the higher grades, because usually in the higher grades, students do not write in print script. They automatically get graduated to the cursive script. So yes, there is a big discussion around it, but then there is no authority anywhere, neither the national curriculum framework, which says which script should be followed in the school, because there are two different schools of thought and everybody follows as per their conviction, I would say. Okay, the last question is
How
how
to
to handle
slow
slow learners.
learner. Right.
Slowly and steadily, that's the only thing, because you know, everybody is in their own journey, and you cannot push them. Even if you push them, nothing happens. And moreover, that is also important that we need to understand. That is exactly the reason why differentiated instruction exists. That is exactly the reason why we talk so much about mixed ability also in the classes. So when we are talking about slow learners, we cannot demotivate them by forcing them to walk along with the brighter ones. Okay. And they are there for 365 days in a school, for 12 years in a school to learn. So that's a long journey where they will learn invariably. So that's all, Preeti.
Yes, ma'am. Uh, Thank you so much, ma'am, for this enlightenment session. Reflecting on today's session, we have gained invaluable insights into understanding diverse assessment methods and their implications of personalized instructions. Learning how assessments guide and refine teaching approaches to meet individual students' need. Embracing student-centered assessment practices to enhance engagement and learning outcomes. Let us carry forward the momentum from today's session and apply these insights to empower our students and elevate our teaching practices. A special thanks to all the participants for your active engagement and thoughtful contribution throughout the session. We will very shortly share the quiz link with you. We'll post the link on the chat box. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Pleasure is mine, Preeti. Thank you for being an excellent moderator.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.